Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. As the Pacific leaders prepare for COP26, civil society continues its campaigning alongside their partners, governments, and development partners to ensure that our priorities are heard and met. The following 2 months will also be a time of increased discussion and events around COP26 and some of the contentious issues that will be discussed, such as loss and damage, climate finance, and so on. PICAN's aim for this day-long event is to help provide some knowledge about the UNFCCC process and thematic areas, particularly the ones that are of key importance to the Pacific. Also included will be a youth-led, Pacific-born, well, particularly born at USP MLS campus, which is where Belinda and I go to school, is the campaign to obtain an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, also known as the ICJAO. This webinar is geared towards young people and any interested individuals who would like to develop more knowledge about COP, the thematic areas, and the ICJAO. So I'll quickly go through the rundown of today's program. So kicking off today will be Dr. Christopher Bartlett from PICAN, and he'll be talking about the UNFCCC process, and it'll basically be an introduction for first-timers. He will also be delivering the session on loss and damage. Following Dr. Bartlett will be Mr. Espen Ronneberg from SPC, and he will discuss adaptation and mitigation. Following him will be Mr. Exley Taloyburi from the Solomon Islands and who works at PIFS, the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, and he will be talking on climate finance. And finally, to end off this day-long event will be Mr. Salman Yo and Mr. Vishal Prasad from the Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change. And they will be talking about the International Court of Justice advisory opinion. So thank you all for joining us today. And I will now introduce our first speaker, Dr. Christopher Bartlett. Christopher Bartlett is a UNFCCC negotiator for Vanuatu and a freelance climate and environmental expert. He has worked extensively in government, civil society, communities, and the private sector. His research interests include innovative and science-based solutions and strategies for dealing with climate change in the Pacific. Dr. Christopher Bartlett, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Satina, and good morning to everybody. Thanks for taking the time to join us on this day-long webinar. It's a long period of time. But I think, as Atina said, the intention is to really get in-depth as possible, to bring the complex and technical negotiation space to all of us who are in the civil society space here in the Pacific. So I will be giving the introduction to the UNFCCC and COP26. Very informal. Belinda will be monitoring the chat box. So if you've got a question as I'm going, feel free to raise your hand or put something in the chat and Belinda will let me know and we can discuss it as we go. So let's make this as useful to you as possible. So without further ado, let's kick off. The presentation today will cover these areas. I'll be giving an introduction, first of all, to PICAN, what this network actually is in the Pacific. Then I'll talk to you more about the UNFCCC itself, the convention itself, moving into the Paris Agreement, and then to some of the major issues that we expect to see at COP26 in just a matter of weeks, beginning the 1st of November. And then I will take you into some brief look at some of the Pacific positions for COP26. Okay, so first of all, what is the Climate Action Network? CAN, as it's affectionately known, is a global network of more than 1,500 civil society organizations across the world. And basically, every member of this network is fighting to take more ambitious action to fight the climate crisis. That's the unifying characteristic of all CAN members. And so the Action Network, it convenes and coordinates civil society at the international level. Now, that said, we should be conscious that CAN has multiple regional nodes according to different geographies. And we are, PICAN, the Pacific regional node of CAN International. So CAN International has basically a board structure And then there's a representation of PICAN. So PICAN then is the Pacific Island Climate Action Network, and it's the only network in the Pacific Islands that has an explicit mandate to link together and support all civil society organizations working on climate change. So lots of networks in the Pacific deal with climate change. PICAN specifically aims at coordinating and supporting their action. So PICAN was established way back in 2013. Its official registration is here in Vanuatu, and our overarching mandate is to advocate for even greater ambitious climate policy, environmental integrity, and action. And what we really aim to do is to support Pacific civil society in their own spaces, helping them to respond to governments and to international and regional negotiations with their own voices and their own aspirations and demands. So PICAN, we have also a board of directors, just like CAN International, and there are 4 national nodes of PICAN in the Solomon Islands, in Vanuatu, in Kiribati, and Tuvalu. That's members outside of those national nodes as well. In fact, we've got members in most of the 14 independent nations of the Pacific. We're also blessed to have 4 secretariat staff working at the moment, and soon hiring. Keep your eyes out on this space. We're going to be hiring 4 project staff for a new Pacific climate policy influencing program. And very soon, within the next days, we're going to be calling for 6 new project staff to work on our COP26 advocacy program for the next 3 months. So some exciting opportunities. Please do share when you see that go through the network. Please do share that. We are working on 4 donor-funded advocacy programs at the moment, all of which are intending to bring member voices and member positions into higher spaces. There's an active Facebook page and Twitter account for PICAN, and the Talanoa list is quite well known. And I hope that you're on it. If you're not, certainly send an email to the PICAN Secretariat. So it's canpacificislands@gmail.com. All right, so what we have coming up over the next days, really, is a public release of the outcomes document from the recent Pacific Climate Justice Summit. So you can expect to see the resultant outcomes, which then feeds into what we're going to do is launch the Pacific COP26 demands and positions from our region, based on the Climate Justice Summit outcomes, as well as other consultations and coordination we've been having, and then go into this very strong advocacy campaign, engaging Pacific civil societies in the lead up to, during, and after COP26. So there's lots coming up in the PICAN space. All right, so let's go straight into the purpose of this first session, which is a very broad but in-depth look at the convention itself. Then we'll go into parts of the presentation. So this convention, the UNFCCC, or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, goes way back. You would have wondered what the 26 means behind COP26. So that's actually the 26th Conference of the Parties. So the convention itself was adopted back in 1992 at the Rio Earth Convention in Brazil. But it took 2 years to actually enter into force, because parties to the convention actually have to ratify in their own parliament. So it took 2 years to get the sufficient number of parties to ratify the convention at the national level. At this stage, there are 197 parties which have ratified the agreement. There are notable parties that have not ratified the convention for different reasons. So what the UNFCCC does is really sets an ambitious goal around carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions. And explicitly in Article 2 of the UNFCCC, the stated goal is to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions to prevent dangerous climate change. And then it goes on to say to allow ecosystems to adapt and protect food production, and allow for sustainable economic development. But the overarching goal of this convention that we realized way back in 1992 was that we had to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions, because otherwise we were going to experience some very, very dangerous impacts. The convention itself also establishes some core principles. And you'll find this in Article 3 of the Convention. The precautionary principle, which means that we don't take action unless there's an abundance of information, data. We're taking precautionary decisions. There's also the principle of equity, which means that no one party has any higher authority than any other. We also see in Article 3 the principle around the right to sustainable development, not as a benefit or something additional, but actually every party has a right to enjoy development that's sustainable. And a very important principle that you'll find in Article 3 of the Convention, and this comes up in nearly every discussion that we have at the UNFCCC level, is this common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, commonly known as CBDRRC. And this means basically that everybody has a common goal, but because of our different contexts and our different development histories and our different capacities, we have different responsibilities, which means that some parties have a responsibility to do more in certain areas than other parties do. For example, in finance. And also in the convention text, you will find a very specific reference to the needs and vulnerabilities of developing countries, as well as the needs and vulnerabilities of small island developing states. So very clear in the convention that says, you know what, developing countries and small island states are in a particularly dire situation and they need more help. Okay. I want to explain a little bit more about what the convention is itself. Some people get confused. See, is actually and is an enforceable instrument that restricts certain countries from doing certain things, and that's actually incorrect. So the UNFCCC is a legal document in international law, but it's a framework agreement. It only establishes general principles and general obligations. It gives kind of an institutional infrastructure for taking decisions and for discussing, and it establishes an intergovernmental process for negotiations. However, in no way is the UNFCCC prescriptive, nor does it provide any legal enforcement mechanisms that could really hold any one party to account. So there's broad latitude for parties to the convention on the choice of their own national policies and their own strategies and their own plans to meet their general obligations in the framework convention. So there's no UNFCCC police that can actually enforce one party to do one thing or the other. All right, on to the structure of the UNFCCC, and it's very important that we understand going into COP26 who are the main bodies and who are the main structural elements of the convention. So first of all, up here at the top, and what I might do is I might zoom in a little bit so that you can see, but so the structure, we've got the COP, then we come down to the Bureau, the subsidiary bodies, we come down to some of the mechanisms, and then the Secretariat. Now let me zoom in and actually read a little bit more on what's on this screen. Okay, so up at the top, you have the COP. And the COP is the well-known under the UNFCCC. And what it is the conference of the parties to the convention. So any party that has actually ratified the convention in their parliament or in their legislature are automatically a member of the COP. And the COP is the highest level decision-making body. In addition to the COP, however, there are several other very important decision-making bodies. There's the CMP, which stands for the Conference of the Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Kyoto Protocol. So the Kyoto Protocol was another instrument of the convention, and so there's a CMP body. And most importantly for us, there's also the Conference of the Parties, serving as the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement, known as the CMA. So it's important to know that there's not just one COP that does everything, but in fact, you've got the COP and the CMA who are both taking plenary decisions about the various elements under either the convention or under the Paris Agreement. Then we come down to the Bureau. And the Bureau is a body that's made up of representatives from the 5 different UN geographical areas. And the job of the Bureau of the UNFCCC is to look at process decisions. They look at any agenda items and they look at any requests for procedural matters. This is the job of the Bureau. Underneath the Bureau, you have 2 permanent, what are called subsidiary bodies. The first subsidiary body is known as SABSTA, which stands for the Subsidiary Body for Scientific and Technological Advice. And as its name implies, this body looks at issues in regards to science and technology. The other subsidiary body, which you can't see now, but I'll show you in a second, is called the SBI, which is the Subsidiary Body for Implementation. And this subsidiary body looks at any and all issues related to the actual implementation of the convention or the Paris Agreement. Under the 2 subsidiary bodies, you also have several bodies, constituted bodies of the convention. So for example, you have the Adaptation Committee, which is a constituted body. And this committee, again, is made up of a representative number of parties. They look at all issues related to adaptation under the convention and the Paris Agreement. We also have a constituted body called the Standing Committee on Finance. And their job is, as the name implies, to look at all issues related to finance, including the financial mechanism of the convention, which is the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund, etc. We have an executive committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. So like adaptation, there's another adaptation committee. There's another committee that looks at loss and damage. And then we've got the Paris Committee on Capacity Building. Under the convention as well, we have a mechanism called the Technology Mechanism, which houses the Executive Committee, the Climate Technology Center and Network, which is kind of like the implementation body for technology. Then there are several expert groups. For example, we've got the Least Developed Countries Expert Group, or the LEG, and we've also got a consultative group of experts on national communications from parties not in Annex 1, which is the CGE. So lots of bodies here, and please, Belinda, if there's anything in the chat, looks like there may be something that I should be seeing here. Okay, recordings look good. Just let me know if there's anything in the chat to discuss. All right, moving to some other bodies within the convention, and I'm just going to zoom to the other side of that diagram. We had the Kyoto Protocol, which was the first mechanism to try to control greenhouse gas emissions through market mechanisms. And under the Kyoto Protocol, we had something called, well, we had the Adaptation Fund Board, because the Adaptation Fund was actually set up to benefit any kind of transfers under Kyoto. I also wanted to highlight the financial mechanism. So we had the technology mechanism, which was the CTCN. We have the financial mechanism, which is the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, and the Green Climate Fund. So many people don't realize that the Global Environment Facility, the big GEF fund, is actually under the financial mechanism of the UNFCCC. There are also other financial arrangements under the constituted bodies like the Special Climate Change Fund, the Least Developed Countries Climate Change Fund, and others. Okay, wanted to show you this slide about the official groupings that you can find under the convention. So as an annex to the convention, they list out different groupings with their responsibilities. So Annex 1 countries, and there are 41 of them, are the developed countries. And these are the countries that the convention specifically says are responsible for adopting mitigation policies and measures. So mitigation in terms of reducing greenhouse gases. So these Annex 1 countries, these are the greenhouse gas emitters. They're developed countries and they're responsible for lowering emissions. Then we have another annex to the convention, which is Annex 2. There are 24 of these countries, and these, in parentheses or brackets, you might call them the rich countries. And it's the responsibility under the convention for these rich countries to provide the financial and technical support to the developing countries. So that's Annex 1 are the greenhouse gas countries. Annex 2 are also greenhouse gas countries, but they're also rich countries, so they're responsible for finance. We come up with Annex B, which is all the Kyoto Protocol countries. And very importantly for us, we have the non-Annex 1 is a developing country, and those are the most vulnerable countries who require the most action and support. Then there's a special grouping of LDCs, which is made up of 46 countries. maybe even 44, and they've got very special status in terms of their limited capacities to adapt and mitigate climate change. So those are the official groupings. So you'll hear a lot about Annex 1, Annex 2, and non-Annex 1. And we in the Pacific, by and large, we are non-Annex 1 countries, and there are several of us that are LDCs, or least developed countries. Okay, I also wanted to highlight here that each of these different groups tend to have very different positions on the thematic areas of negotiations. And that makes sense. So the developed countries who are responsible for mitigating have the most flexibility and leniency for mitigating to climate change because it's going to cost them resources to mitigate. Annex 2 countries, the rich countries, they want to have the most flexibility and leniency on providing finance because at the end of the day, it's their taxpayers that are going to be paying for climate change. And then, of course, we in the non-Annex 1 countries, we've got very ambitious calls and demands to see action so that we don't suffer the impacts. What you can do if you want to have a read of the different positions of these different groups, you can go onto the UNFCCC website, which is unfccc.int, and you can go to the special section of the website called the submissions portal. And this is a public registry for any party or any grouping to submit their own positions according to a particular issue. So if you want to know, for example, what some of the rich countries are saying about finance, you can go to the submissions portal and read what the United States or the European Union or any of the other Annex 2 countries are saying about finance. If you want to read, for example, what the LDCs are saying about loss and damage, you can go to the submissions portal and read word for word what the least developed countries are proposing for loss and damage. So it's a very useful tool. And I encourage you, if you're interested in a particular thematic area that you'll learn about today, to go on to the submissions portal and read some of the most recent submissions. And there are submissions as of today that countries are putting on. So you can see things over the last few months, or you can go back all 26 years of negotiations back to the beginning and see what people have been saying. Okay, on to the next slide. I have here, let's see if it allows me to click. Okay, I want to bring up very important, and that's the role of science in the UNFCCC. So right from the beginning, the UNFCCC negotiations were based on the principle of science driving the negotiation. And this has been sadly a contentious area. Because the convention itself is a party-driven political process, often politics want to color or change the way that science is presented. But that goes contrary to what the UNFCCC was founded on. And so it's very common that you will hear the most ambitious countries, or the high ambition countries, actually refer back to the need for science-based policy. There's a couple of scientific links that are very well established. They are not in doubt. The first is that the average global temperature of the planet is directly linked to the concentration of greenhouse gases. Now, there's a lot of pseudoscience out there that says what we're seeing here is warming that's not related to anthropogenic greenhouse gases, but that there may be other natural forcings or cycles that are causing the current warming. That's not what science says. Science says that the current average temperature is directly linked to greenhouse gases. The second very clearly established scientific link is that greenhouse gases have been steadily rising since the Industrial Revolution as a direct result of human activities, and primarily because of burning fossil fuels, because of change in land use. This is a clearly established scientific link that we're seeing increased gases because of human emissions. The third area of science is that urgent action is required in order for us to be able to minimize climate impacts. So if we delay on action, we'll have more climate impacts. So these are three very clearly established scientific links. What I want to do now is show you a little bit of how the science plays into the UNFCCC. So we have something called the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, the IPCC was actually founded under the United Nations WMO, which is the World Meteorological Organization, and the United Nations Environment Program, which is UNEP. So it wasn't actually founded under the UNFCCC. However, the UNFCCC constantly acknowledges the work of the IPCC as it's making its decision making. So it is, for the UNFCCC, the leading body for the assessment of worldwide climate change research. Right now, the IPCC is working on its sixth assessment cycle report, or AR6, Assessment Report 6. And let me tell you a little bit more about how the convention itself refers to the IPCC. So you can see that the IPCC is an official constituted body. However, in Article 21 of the convention, it actually states that the Secretariat of the UNFCCC, including the SABA, which is the subsidiary body, they're supposed to cooperate closely with IPCC. So there's a requirement in the convention that we look at the reports of the IPCC. What is AR6? So this assessment report has actually started way back in 2015. And there are going to be three major reports. The first one is a report on the physical science of climate change. And that report was just released in August of 2021. And you've probably heard a lot of news about the terrifying results from that assessment report. Very shortly, we're expecting to have another report released by the IPCC on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, with specific consideration of geographical regions. So they're going to make a very concrete assessment of science for the Pacific region in terms of impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. We're going to also expect in the coming months a working group 3 report on mitigation. And I also want to call your attention to 3 special reports which have already been launched. You can find online. One is the special report on global warming of 1.5, which is the temperature target of the Paris Agreement. We've all got a special report on climate change and land, and another report on the oceans and cryosphere in a changing climate. The IPCC also revised in 2019 the guidelines on greenhouse gases. So the whole package has to be finalized by September of 2022, which will be just before we go into COP27. However, for COP26, what we have are the 3 special reports as well as the new physical science basis. So you're going to hear at COP26 a lot of reference to the AR6 reports that have already been released. Okay, let's go through the findings of the first working group of the AR6, the first working group on the physical science basis. So what they've done is actually looked at thousands of studies from around the world and shown what exactly is happening with temperature over time. And what you got here on the left axis is global average temperature. And you can see that around 1850, we were at 0 degrees warming. So this is global average warming. And then over time, starting during the Industrial Revolution in the 1900s, we've seen a dramatic increase in the temperature change from global baselines. So the big question is, have the goals of the UNFCCC been achieved? And as you recall, the major goal of the convention was to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions and avoid the major impacts. So that was back in 1991. So the question is, since we established the UNFCCC in 1991, look what has happened to global average temperature increase. So basically the answer that we can come up with very clearly is no. The UNFCCC is very, very far from stabilizing greenhouse gas emissions and very, very far from avoiding dangerous climate change. And we need to keep this firmly in the front of our minds when we go to COP, because it's not just about talking and making agreements, it's about actually achieving impacts for our climate system. And we have not done that under the UNFCCC. And many countries, including those in the Pacific, are saying this is totally unacceptable. We set out in 1991 to change the climate system, and here we are in 2021, COP26, and we have failed. And unless we change the direction that we're going, we are going to completely have missed the boat on the entire UNFCCC process. Okay, some scary findings from this Working Group 1 report that was just released on the 9th of August. First, it is unequivocal. Now that is a big word. It is unequivocal that human influence warms the atmosphere. Unequivocal means there is no doubt. Another key finding of this working group report is that widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, in the oceans, in the cryosphere, and the biosphere have already occurred. This is not a future scenario. This is a here and now critical crisis that we're facing. Another quite scary finding from this report was that many changes that have already occurred are now irreversible. Irreversible means that we cannot unchange them. Now that we've experienced these impacts, we've locked ourselves in for centuries to millennia. Now that is terrifying because what we're seeing in the Pacific, these impacts are catastrophic. And the fact that they're irreversible, no matter what happens with greenhouse gases in the future, is terrifying. And then the report actually went into some very specific geographical predictions. And with very high confidence, and this is just one example, I encourage you to go to the actual report and look at all the projections. With very high confidence, we can expect heavy rainfall events increasing in the Western tropical Pacific. This is based on thousands of studies from around the world. So it's now very clear what we can expect with climate change because of human anthropogenic emissions. Okay, let's go on to, so we looked at the convention itself and what it is and what it's not. We looked at the role of science in the convention. And now let's look at this new instrument, which is called the Paris Agreement, which is under the convention, but different to the convention. So the Paris Agreement was negotiated back at COP15 and COP21 in 2015. And the Paris Agreement has three big sections. The first section of the Paris Agreement, like the convention, is all about greenhouse gas emissions, specifically limiting global temperature increase. And in the Paris Agreement, there are two numbers that are critical. The first is that we all aim to limit increases to 2 degrees, and specifically aim to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above baseline level. So that is the first part of the Paris Agreement, is all about temperature limits and achieving net zero by mid-century. So net zero emissions means we are emitting as much as we're absorbing. So there's a net zero going into the atmosphere. The second part of the Paris Agreement are the articles that talk about enhancing resilience and adaptation and loss and damage. So more on the impact side, whereas the first part is on the temperature and emission side. The second part is on, okay, well, what do we do about the impacts? And the third part of the Paris Agreement is all about, okay, and now how do we do it? What's the money? Where is it coming from? What's the technology that's available? What are the partnerships and institutions? So it's more that like implementation side. And to show you, so this graph is about the 1.5. So it's now enshrined within the Paris Agreement, this goal of limiting temperatures to 1.5. Sadly, last month have shown that we are on track for a 3 to 4 degree increase in global average temperature by the end of the century. Now that is well beyond our 1.5 degree Paris Agreement goal. So again, as we go into the negotiations and as we're talking about the Paris Agreement, you'll find many countries right up front saying we are not only failing, but we're on track to fail, and therefore this is why we need this position or that position. So we're constantly going back to the science. We're constantly going back to the temperature and greenhouse gas emission goals of the Paris Agreement. Okay, a very important note here, a point of interest, is that many countries, when they ratified the Paris Agreement, they actually said emissions reduction obligations are not enough. So the Paris Agreement didn't go far enough. And Vanuatu was one of those. An excerpt from the Vanuatu submission of ratification to the UNFCCC. And other countries even said things like, we're not going to waive our rights to claim for compensation to loss and damage. Even though in the decision to the Paris Agreement, there is a statement about compensation, many countries said, we're not going far enough and we're not going to waive our right. If we're losing or being impacted by climate change, then we're going to claim for compensation. Okay, here's another diagram of the Paris Agreement with the specific articles. So I just wanted to highlight a few very important articles so that when you hear people talking about Article 6 or Article 8, you know what we're talking about within the Paris Agreement. So let's start with the first section, the section 1 of that agreement, which is about emissions and temperature. So in the section 1, we've got Article 4, which is all about mitigation, the temperature goal, etc. That's in Article 4. Then we've got something called Article 6, and this is trading of greenhouse gas emissions. So you might have heard about RED Plus or cooperative mechanisms or a big carbon emissions trading scheme. That's happening in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And if you're interested in forests, if you're from the high islands in the Pacific, like Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, there's a whole article on the role of forests in the Paris Agreement. Okay, jumping over to the second part of the Paris Agreement, which is all about resilience and adaptation and loss and damage, we've got an entire article dedicated to adaptation, that's it, Article 7. And we've also got an article dedicated to loss and damage, which is Article 8. So you'll often hear people not even mention adaptation. They'll say, we're going to the Article 7 negotiations or the Article 8 negotiations, and you know that it's adaptation or loss and damage. Then the third part of the Paris Agreement, which is about, okay, how do we do it? Where's the money? What are the institutions? Finance flows, etc. So there's an Article 9 specifically on finance, which talks about upscaling finance, and we'll hear a lot more today about that. There's a specific article on technology and how do we get technology upscaled and transferred to developing countries so that they can actually mitigate and adapt. And then there's a whole article building, which is Article 11, which again is about transferring and building the capacity of skills and knowledge in developing countries. And so often you'll hear this word support, and that word support refers to finance support, technology support, and capacity support. So when you hear parties talk about support, they're actually talking about all three of those things. So those are the three big elements of the Paris Agreement and the articles which refer to the specific topics. And so when we go to negotiating on the specific articles of the Paris Agreement. Okay, very importantly, in the Paris Agreement, we have now codified this idea that every country on their own has to make a contribution to the global goal of climate change under the Paris Agreement. And that contribution that they make, which is basically their own country priority or country policy, is called the NDC, or the nationally determined contribution. And inside that NDC, every country is required to articulate how it is that they're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, how it is that they're going to implement adaptation action, what are they going to do about loss and damage, and what are their finance kind of targets, whether it's providing finance or receiving finance. So all of that should be contained within the NDC. Now, the NDC is kind of like a promise, but there's no real enforcement mechanism. So one country, for example, could say that they're going to do something, but in fact, they don't do it. There's no real mechanism to punish them or take them to court or require that they do that. It's kind of like a pinky promise. Yeah, we're going to try. If we do, maybe we'll try again later. So in the Paris Agreement, every country is required to submit an NDC every 5 years. And the reason that we've put that in the Paris Agreement is so that every country kind of has to constantly assess where it is, where it's going, and what it commits to the global Paris Agreement goals. So I hope that you've heard a lot about NDCs. I hope you know what your own country NDC says, and I hope that you as civil society are putting pressure both on Pacific governments as well as non-Pacific governments to actually increase the ambition of NDCs. And that's been a huge political call outside the negotiation process, for example, by the UK presidency, by, for example, the Climate Vulnerable Forum. They're saying our NDCs are nowhere near enough. What you need to do now is enhance and resubmit an NDC before COP26. So just a few days ago, there was an assessment report that the UNFCCC Secretariat put out that looked at all the NDCs. And I think yesterday's or this week's report was 72 NDCs. And basically what they found is that we are nowhere near meeting our emission reduction goals or our adaptation resilience goals or loss and damage goals based on what's in the NDC. So basically the NDCs are nowhere near enough. And so what the Secretariat, what the UK presidency, what high ambition countries, they're calling for all countries to look at what they've got and make it more ambitious. Revise it, enhance it, and resubmit it before COP26. Because COP26 is going to be the time where we say, are we serious about this climate change issue, or are we just playing around? Okay, going into COP26 now. COP26 is happening soon. We are a mere, I think 7 weeks away from the beginning of the 26th Conference of the Parties to the UNFCCC. It's also going to be the third time that the Conference of the Parties or the meeting of the parties to the Paris Agreement, the CMA, meet. So it's COP CMA 3, all happening in 7 weeks. It's going to happen in Glasgow, Scotland, under the presidency of the United Kingdom with support of the government of Italy. The outgoing COP presidency was the government of Chile, and the incoming COP presidency, which will hit the gavel on the 1st of November, will be the UK. No articles of the Paris Agreement are going to be negotiated at COP26. So much of the Paris Agreement has already been worked out. The rules, the processes, the requirements, the protocols, the templates, a lot of that has been worked out since COP21, when the Paris Agreement was formally established. There are only a few bits and pieces that still need additional negotiation. And so be aware that you may be very interested, for example, in forests, but forests might not be a major issue at all at COP26 because we're well on the way to implementing the Paris Agreement. That said, there are a few key hot button issues which absolutely will be a part of the COP26 package. And before I tell you what those issues are, we refer to a package because at the end of the day, decisions are not taken in isolation. So although one whole set of negotiators is going to be talking about, they're not going to make any decisions until they know what the other group of negotiators that are talking about last amendment are thinking of agreeing to. And if those guys are not happy with what those girls are doing, then there's no agreement whatsoever. And we've seen this happen time and time again, where one issue can actually completely block progress on all the issues because it's a package and you have to see it as a package and everything has to be agreed as a package. So what are the package key issues at COP26? The first one is absolutely probably the most contentious and the most important is the negotiation around carbon markets, or Article 6. Now, the reason why this is so important is because it's the last piece of the Paris Agreement rulebook that has not been agreed. So the Paris Agreement rulebook, you can flip through and say, okay, what do we need to do for loss and damage? What do we need to do for our capacity? What do we need on finance? If you go to the section on Article 6 carbon markets, there is nothing. There is zero decisions around carbon markets. And that's why there's such pressure for COP26 to finally overcome some of the blocks and start negotiating the real rules for how these carbon markets are going to work. The other big issue that we will discuss at COP26 is around finance. And finance plays in lots of different areas of the negotiation. We're going to be looking at the new global finance goal. We're going to be looking at the financial mechanism, like, for example, the Green Climate Fund, the GCF. We're going to be looking at how countries report on finance they provide and report on finance they receive. So finance is kind of interwoven throughout the whole negotiation. Very importantly, there's going to be the third area of the package, which is around transparency. So we've agreed already that countries have to report the action that they're taking biannually. So we have something called the Biennial Transparency Report, or the BTR. What we don't have yet are the actual templates that countries have to fill in order to report all that action they're doing. So at this COP, we're going to be negotiating the actual Excel templates, what column, what row, what's the data, what's the unit. That's going to be negotiated at this COP. Very importantly for us in the Pacific, loss and damage has emerged as one of the key make or break issues at COP26, where we're going to be negotiating around the Santiago network, which is a network intended to actually help countries on the ground deal with loss and damage. And then adaptation, another very important part of the Paris Agreement. We'll be talking about the Adaptation Communications Registry as well as the National Adaptation Plan process. So this, in a nutshell, is what are going to be the key issues. That's not to say there won't be a meeting here or there on capacity, a meeting here on reality, but these 5 issues are the COP26 package. Okay, I just wanted to let you know that the Pacific has actually been an incredible player within the UNFCCC process and the Paris Agreement process right from the beginning. So a couple of examples, the Alliance of Small Island States, which includes all of the Pacific, as well as Caribbean and African you know that Pacific nation of Vanuatu was actually the founding chair of AOSIS way back in the 1990s. And Vanuatu and the Pacific were the first countries to call for loss and damage. Fiji hosted the COP23, which was held in Germany, but it was actually hosted by Fiji as the president of COP. So this set the Pacific leaps and bounds above where it was in terms of having that political clout within the UNFCCC. I also want to mention that there are several groupings. One, for example, the High Ambition Coalition, which was actually founded by the Marshall Islands. And even till today, the HAC, the High Ambition Coalition, plays an outsized role in influencing climate negotiations at COPs. So the Pacific is right there, front and center. I also wanted to give you a little bit of a view of how some of the negotiation blocks happen. Now, these are blocks based on similar interests. There is a group of 77 countries, including China. It's called G77 in China. These are the developing countries, and they have grouped together as a negotiating bloc. And the reason that they've grouped together as a negotiating bloc is because there is power in numbers. If one country, for example, the Philippines, makes a call for a certain position, then it's taken with, okay, yes, you're a party, thank you very much, maybe, maybe not. But if all 134 developing countries come together and make one call as a unified bloc, it's very hard for countries or other parties to ignore that or bypass that call. So by grouping together, you actually have much more power in the negotiation space. And so very often at COP26, what you'll hear is a country speaking on behalf of one of these huge groups with lots of countries. So we in the Pacific, we're all members of the G77. We in the Pacific, we're also all members of AOSIS, which is the SIDS grouping. And there are 39 of us around the world, including all 14 of us in the Pacific. Some of us in the Pacific are also members of the LDC group, which is 46 countries now, least developed countries. And they also negotiate as a bloc. And what you'll find is there's often quite a lot of similarity between what the AOSIS bloc calls for and what the LDC calls for. So very commonly, you'll see these two groups working closely together. There are two other groups which work very closely together with us in the Pacific. One is the AGN, which is the African group of negotiators. So these are all African countries. They've joined together to negotiate with powerful voices. Very often we work hand in hand with AOSIS and LDCs and AGN to get very strong unified positions. And there's also another group called the ILAC group, which is the Independent Alliance of Latin American and Caribbean countries. They also tend to have very similar positions to us in the Pacific, and AOSIS, LDCs, AGN, and G77 in China. Now, there are other groups which sometimes do and sometimes don't have positions that are close to the Pacific. Actually, more often not than with. So we've got the like-minded developing countries. There's the European Union. They negotiate as a bloc. There's the umbrella group, which importantly for us includes both Australia, New Zealand, and the US, all very powerful kind of Pacific periphery countries. Therefore, the umbrella group. And then there's the environmental integrity group. So be aware that we, as the Pacific and our nations and civil society, we need to be very closely aligned to the politics of these different groups. It would be unusual if Pacific civil society would be successful by aligning with one country and one country alone. But if we as Pacific civil society can support and align with and call for the positions that these groups are calling for, either AOSIS or LDCs, G77 in China, etc., then there's a high chance that we can actually mobilize some real transformational change. Sometimes I should mention that these groups don't go far enough. It's possible that AOSIS or LDCs may not have a position that's as ambitious as we in civil society would like. And in that case, it's perfectly acceptable for us as civil society to call a bilateral with the chairman of these groups, or to make a statement to say, we want to go further. So civil society is kind of a special group. We're observers. We have no say in the decision-making process, but we are in the room and we can make statements in the room. Okay, again, if you want to see what different parties are saying in these groups, go to the submissions portal. So if you go to the UNFCCC website, you can go to the submissions portal and you can see every submission that's been made, including up until the last few days, from the different negotiating groups. You'll often see something from Antigua and Barbuda. They are the representative or the presidency of AOSIS. You'll often see something from Bhutan, which is the representative of the LDC. And you can read what the positions are for these different groups, and that would help you, as your civil society agency in the Pacific, kind of define what's realistic and what's not realistic for a position for COP26. And that's what we as PICAN have done. We've looked at these different groups, we looked at what our Pacific and then we've come up with what we feel is an ambitious COP26 Pacific kind of position statement. Okay, the CAN International, Climate Action Network International, has also come up with its own 5-point plan for COP26. And this 5-point plan was developed, first of all, by CAN International members, including those of us in the Pacific, as well as linking with some developing country leaders. So in the LDCs, AOSIS, AGN, etc. And so this 5-point plan actually states that there are going to be 5 key asks for COP26. The first is around mitigation and emissions. We have got to get to net zero very fast, and it has to be led by those with the greatest responsibility. That's pretty clear. The second call by our civil society, CAN International, is that the progress that we've made on finance is just unacceptable. We are so far behind the goal of 100 billion that we are suffering in the developing world. And as civil society, we are calling for richer nations to step up much faster and meet those commitments that they made even before the Paris Agreement. On adaptation, what civil society CAN International is calling is a specific goal which states that 50% of the money that's raised for climate change must go to adaptation. In terms of loss and damage, there is a call that all countries need to look at loss and damage, and that the responsibility for loss and damage, particularly for financing loss and damage, has to be shouldered by the rich developed countries. And then in terms of implementation, this is the fifth point of the plan, is that we need, by COP26, to finalize all the outstanding items on transparency, carbon trading, Article 6, and timeframes. If we don't get those minimum 3 points, then civil society's view is that COP23 will have failure. All right, so where have we come over the last year? So you know that COP25 was held in Spain with Chile as the presidency. Since COP25, because of COVID, they completely delayed COP26. It should have actually happened last year in 2020. It was totally delayed. So there have been no official negotiation since December of 2019. So it's been 2 years since there's been any official decision making. That said, we did have a couple of months ago the subsidiary bodies for the convention, which was held virtually. No decisions were taken, but parties were able to kind of negotiate and get common ideas and discussions, and there were papers put out. No decisions, but at least there was some progress. Then in July, we had the Asia Pacific Climate Week, and there were lots of virtual Pacific and other countries in the Asian Pacific region made kind of statements, and ministers were there. So we have been making progress, although there's been no official decision since COP25. So the presidency of COP26, as I mentioned, is the United Kingdom, supported by Italy. And the UK, as the president, can't actually take any decisions, but it can set political landing areas that they want to see. And they have identified 4 goals. This is the UK presidency. The first goal is that they want to secure net zero by mid-century and keep 1.5. And we as civil society should be incredibly thankful that the presidency this year has held the 1.5 line. They haven't reverted back to 2 degrees, try for 2. They've actually said we have to keep 1.5 within reach. The second goal that they've set is around adaptation for the most vulnerable, including loss and damage. And at the beginning, they weren't talking about loss and damage, but now the president is actually talking about loss and damage in every speech that they make as a key goal. The third goal is around finance, and the fourth goal is a collective process where everybody, not just countries, but businesses and private sector people and us, civil society, we're all part of the package. Okay, getting a little bit more in detail, because this is very important. If we are aligned with the COP presidency, then we're aligned with the political momentum of COP26. So in terms of first goal around emissions and temperature, the COP26 presidency is calling for an accelerated phase out of coal. Now, believe it or not, the UK is a major coal producer, and they themselves are calling to make coal history, to completely phase it out, which is quite incredible. The COP presidency is also calling for a reduction in deforestation. They're calling on a switch to electric vehicles and investment in renewable energies. And so they've set up political processes, not negotiation processes, but political processes at COP26 to get countries to make statements, political statements about these kinds of goals. Australia phase out coal. That's what the COP26 presidency is asking for. Will Brazil curtail deforestation? That's what COP presidency is asking them to do in political statements at COP26. Okay, in terms of adaptation, which is the second goal, they want to see nature being a very strong focus for protecting and restoring ecosystems, as well as avoiding loss and damage to homes, livelihoods, lives, etc. So they've explicitly stated nature, loss and damage, and kind of infrastructure, resilient agriculture is their key themes around that adaptation goal. In terms of mobilizing finance, the UK presidency is calling on all developed countries to make good on their promise of 100 billion in climate finance per year. And we're going to hear from Exley later today about this goal, but we have not yet met 100 billion, and we've already passed the 2020 deadline. So UK presidency is calling for all developed countries to step up and actually meet that commitment. And then the fourth goal is working together. What I want to see is that we finalize the Paris rulebook and that we have much greater collaboration between businesses and civil society and governments. So very good calls. Whether or not they have the political influence to get countries to make statements on those calls, we shall see. Now, I wanted to give you all some of the points we have been hearing coming out from major leaders around the world going into COP. So the UN Secretary General, this is Antonio Guterres, he made a statement this week about this new report that I mentioned on NDCs. And what he says is today's report on the NDCs shows that we are breaking the promise that we made 6 years ago to pursue 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. So he is actually telling countries, you are failing because your NDCs are weak. You are breaking the promise you made in the Paris Agreement. Now, this is serious language. And this is where that political discussion comes in. If we can shame as civil societies, our countries, they themselves have failed. In the Pacific and beyond, we have failed to reach ambitious commitments. The second thing he said is that failure to meet this goal will be measured in loss and damage. So he's now making the clear link, which is very important for this high level, between the success of the Paris Agreement and the amount of loss and damage that we see. And failure means loss and damage. Success means no loss and damage. And what he's done also, and I thank him very much for this, he has actually made a call for all nations, not rich countries, not developed countries, all nations need to submit a new NDC before COP26. So the official requirement is that a country submits an NDC every 5 years. What he's saying is not good enough. Your NDCs are not good enough. Submit another one before COP26. COP26 is in 7 weeks. So what he's calling on countries to do is get their act together and submit something else before COP26. And it would be incredible if we in the Pacific could actually encourage our own governments to set the standard. Wouldn't it be amazing if every Pacific Island government before COP26 submitted a more ambitious NDC with loss and damage and with adaptation and with additional finance requirements? It would just set the stage, and the Pacific would be leading. Another statement that he made is that there is this huge level of mistrust that we still have between North and South, developed and developing. And the big mistrust comes on this issue of support. So we in the Pacific, we in developing countries, we are not seeing the support that was promised. We're not seeing the technology, we're not seeing the capacity building, and we're definitely not seeing the finance that was promised in the Paris Agreement. So these are some of the political statements being made just in the last few days. Patricia Espinosa, she is the executive secretary of the UNFCCCC Secretariat, and she's also calling for bold and courageous climate leadership. She says that COP26 is basically a credibility test, whether or not we're serious about this climate issue or whether we're not. And she says that leaders have to respond or we're missing this goal on 1.5. She says here we have at best 1 decade. So we've been hearing a lot of people say 12 years, 10 years. She says at best a decade, which is 10 years. And basically, this quote I really love: ability to make difficult decisions. And the problem is that failing to decide is actually the same as deciding to fail. So if we just postpone and just have nice talks and don't actually come up with real actionable decisions, then we have decided to fail. And therefore COP26 is, we've shown our incredulous. Okay, some other big voices. This is the president of COP26. This is Alok Sharma. He will be front and center of everything that's going on at 26. He's said just in the last few days, 1.5 degree target is critical. Every fraction of a degree makes a difference. So he's actually touting the line of AOSIS. We were the ones that pushed for 1.5 degrees. He's also holding the G20 to account. He says the G20 is key to 1.5. They represent 80% of emissions. They represent 85% of the economy. However, only 13 of you guys, the big countries, have committed to net zero, and only 8 of you have submitted NDCs that are even close to ambitious enough. So he says this must change before COP26 in November. So he's calling on the G20 countries, the biggest, most powerful countries, to do more before COP26 in there. He also said coal power has to end. Countries have to make a commitment to end coal power at COP26. And then, of course, he talks a lot about financing. There's some really important calls. If you're interested in hearing more, he's just released a TED Talk. So if you go to YouTube, you can watch his TED Talk, and he actually outlines what he wants countries to do in the next 7 weeks before COP26. Okay, look, we are coming to the end of the time, and I want to make sure that we've got chance for questions and comments. I'll just mention a few of these initiatives. So the COP26 presidency has designed something called Race to Zero, where he's trying to get countries, businesses, and others to articulate how they're going to get to zero emissions. They've also set this Race to Zero for private sector. We've also got the Adaptation and Resilience Call for Action, which is getting countries to step up and deliver on adaptation support. There's an initiative called the She Changes Climate Initiative. And this was set up by the British government to try to get gender equality and gender equity happening within the COP processes. So you may be interested in learning more about that. As I've already mentioned, there's the High Ambition Coalition, which was established by Republic of the Marshall Islands in the Pacific. And they have called on, for COP26, a Justice League for Climate Diplomacy. So actually looking at climate justice in terms of the UNFCCC. The Climate Vulnerable Forum is an important grouping of the most vulnerable. And they just called, like last week, just called on all countries to submit NDCs every year. Not wait every 5 years, but submit an NDC every single year, because we're so far behind the goal. If we wait 5 years, we're going to miss it. So the CVF has just made that call just in the last week. I want to highlight here the fact that negotiations at COP26 are not just about the policy of the Paris Agreement or the UNFCCC. And we in civil society, particularly in the Pacific, we need to take advantage of all the other things that are happening at COP26. First of all, fundraising. Anybody, any donor who's interested or related to climate change is going to somehow be involved in COP26. So if you, your CSO in the Pacific requires finance for climate change, you need to be talking with those donors, and you'll be able to have virtual e-meetings, and there'll be donor dialogues and donor roundtables. Don't miss the opportunity to fundraise for your NGO, for your civil society, for your campaign. There's also going to be a lot of network and partnership building happening. Maybe there's another NGO in another part of the world, or maybe another NGO in the Pacific that you don't know about. COP26 is going to have a lot of side events and a lot of activities where you can actually build partnerships and networks to help further your Pacific CSO aims and goals. Promoting successes is key. So many times, the global community does not hear the voices of the Pacific, all the amazing work that we're doing every single day in grassroots communities and island communities in the Pacific. So COP26 will be a chance for you to showcase some of your successes. So PICAN will actually be negotiating to get side event slots in multiple side event activities during the COP, over the 3 weeks of the COP. So if you're small NGO or civil society organization wants to showcase what you've been doing, let PICAN know, and we will do our best to get you a speaking slot in one of the side events where you can, tell the world about all the amazing things you've done. There's also a chance for some bilateral diplomacy. So participating in COP26, you'll have ambassadors and attaches and other very important individuals. If you want to have a bilateral with them, PICAN can help set that up. If you want to have a bilateral, for example, with the negotiator from the US, let PICAN know, and through our networks, we'll try and set that up for you. There's also a great chance for policy advocacy as well as training. Almost every day, 4 or 5 times a day, there'll be a training activity where you as a civil society organization can join remotely and learn something about greenhouse gas calculations, about loss and damage assessments, about finance, anything that you could possibly want to know. There will be a training session at COP26 on that topic. So take advantage. Don't think if you're not in the negotiating room, you've got nothing to gain. There's actually so much just by participating in the process. Okay, some of the things that are coming up in the next days and weeks. We've got the Youth Summit coming up at the end of this month. And we've got several Pacific delegates, youth delegates that are going to either be in Italy, in Milan, or participate virtually to set very strong youth positions for COP26. There's also going to be a pre-COP, which brings together around 40 countries. Some of the most influential countries in the world are going to go to pre-COP in Italy the first week of October. And they're going to try to identify the landing zones for those really tricky issues. So they're not going to negotiate because everybody's not there, but they're going to kind of set the parameters and say what's possible and what's not possible. We've also got quite a few meetings coming up. For example, there's a high-level session on Asia Pacific. There's a Santiago Network Marketplace. If you go to the UNFCCC website, you can go to the calendar of events and you can see what's happening. Most of these meetings are virtual. So even if you're not a negotiator, you can still listen in on these meetings. You can hear what the Prime Minister of Fiji says or what the President of Kiribati says. So you can actually listen and observe what's going on. Very quickly, in the last 5 minutes of this presentation, I wanted to let you know some of the politics that are going on in terms of COP26. So CAN International made a call last week that COP26 should actually be postponed. And the reason that they made this call is because COP26 will not be safe in terms of coronavirus, nor will it be inclusive. There are many, many delegations, particularly from the developing world, that will not participate in person in COP26 for a variety of reasons, because of the COVID health issues, because of the logistics with closed borders, because of the expense of putting people in quarantine for weeks on end, both coming and going, because of the possibility that you might get stuck and not be able to come back to your country. So many countries around the world are going to be sending greatly reduced delegations. And in the Pacific, I have a feeling that many of our country delegations will not be attending in person. So that's why CAN said we must postpone COP because it's not fair and it will be inequitable. Now, a lot of people responded strongly to that. They said, no, we have to have a COP because the crisis, and if we slow down and this and that, and CAN agrees that action needs to be taken. However, their position about postponement was simply looking at safety and equity. AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States, they put out a statement last week that said, no, we have to go ahead. AOSIS is ready, we're willing. The only beneficiaries of postponing COP will be the fossil fuel industry. So we have to have a COP. And so immediately the COP presidency responded by saying, okay, we hear loud and clear that this COP is going to be difficult. So therefore, based on your calls for postponement, we're not going to postpone, but we are going to make support available for the people who need it the most. So quarantine costs are going to be now fully covered for all those countries on the red list. We're going to make extra allowances to get people here and to make them safe and all that. So it's good that civil society is making these demands and people are actually responding and say, oh, okay, well, we'll do this and we'll do that. And so thanks to all, both civil society and governments, for that to and fro, which is now yielding greater outcomes. So I think what I'll tell you on the last slide here is that over the next week, we are going to launch the Pacific COP26 demands. And it'll be a draft, and we'll put it on this website, which is pacificdemands.org. So this is the COP25 demands from the Pacific. So we'll update this website in the next week with the draft COP26 demands. And then over the next month, up until mid-October, we'll be taking a very extensive consultation process to refine and add and edit those demands. By mid-October, then we can launch to the world and say, this is what the Pacific is calling from COP26. So I invite all of you to participate in that process. You'll be seeing a lot more on social media and the PICAN Talanoa emails. And with that, I will end 15 minutes early so that we can have a little bit of question and answer and discussion and comment. And yes, please be open and candid and frank, and let's have a really good chat to make sure that we're all on the same page about UNFCCC and what's coming for 2026. Thank you so much, and over to you, Atina, to facilitate.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chris, for your breakdown of the UNFCCC process, the role of science in the COP negotiations, as well as reminding us for the dire situation we find ourselves in. You gave a very comprehensive presentation today, and I'm sure all our participants had a lot to take in and a lot to process. So we'll now open the floor for discussions. We already have one in the chat box. It's from Mahendra Kumar. Mr. Kumar, would you like to unmute so you could ask this question directly, or would you like me to read it out for you?
Yeah, thank you. I don't mind either way. I could probably just repeat what I have said. I just wanted a little bit of discussion on, when you talk about the host leadership and so on, and Chris very aptly sort of said, I mean, UK, they're making all these headlines. They will make sure they take the lead on adaptation and the 1.5 degrees. But some of the actions bilaterally on international circles seems to be contrary to these sorts of headline grabbing sort of statements. For example, the recent deal with Australia, where apparently the trade deal, they agreed to remove the reference to 1.5 degrees. I mean, that was, I thought, a great opportunity for UK to prevail on Australia and others. But in this case, we know we're talking about Australia because it is in our region, it's a member of the forum, and it's a well-known climate laggard. So surely, I mean, I think the UK, as the president, as the host, needs to be told in no uncertain terms that this is not really the kind of leadership or example they should be leading by. So I just wanted some comments and discussions, if it is warranted, on that. Thank you.
Kumar, that is a really important statement. I think it's very easy to talk ambitiously, but we need to look at people's actions. The UK, incidentally, is also giving out new coal exploration licenses as we speak. So there's a lot of hypocrisy happening. And the question that you asked at the end of your chat is, could PICAN become more aggressive in actually calling out governments in terms of meeting the 1.5 goal? And I think this is absolutely the role of civil society, is to be as ambitious as we can. And I think we in the Pacific, we are surrounded by countries that are not taking ambitious action on both sides of the Pacific and North. And so we have that role. And you can expect to see in the PICAN COP26 demands some very targeted language around some of those parties that are not doing their fair share and not even acting serious about this. So that's great. If anybody else wants to comment on, calling out parties or some of the ambition statements for PICAN or COP26, please do state now, and then maybe we can go on to the next question after that.
I think there are no more comments, so we can go ahead to the next question. The next question comes from Willie Misak. He's asking, what could a potential loss and damage position for the Pacific region be towards COP26, and what are the major challenges for loss and damage when it comes to finance during the COP negotiations?
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Willie. Look, I think loss and damage for us in the Pacific is one of the salient issues. We are one of the regions that we see loss and damage every day, every year in the Pacific. We've got that moral authority too, because we are also possibly going to experience the most severe loss and damage, which is loss of our islands. So I think the Pacific has kind of that role and responsibility to be the most ambitious. At COP26, what we're going to be negotiating on is this Santiago network for loss and damage. And this network, and I'll talk about this in the next presentation, really is supposed to help countries in a meaningful way to deal with loss and damage, not just a few reports here or there or a workshop, but actually respond to country requests. So I think for the Pacific, we need to see that Santiago network be operationalized immediately, robustly, and with action that happens for Pacific Island countries. So you'll see in the PICAN COP26 position statement some very concrete ideas that have come out of the Climate Justice Summit and consultations about that. But I think it's mostly going to be around the loss and damage network, the Santiago network, as well as finance for loss and damage. Who pays when we in the Pacific and others experience loss and damage? But great question. I think that's going to be one of the big issues at COP26.
Thank you, Dr. Chris, for that answering the question. Are there any more from the audience? Perhaps here's one that could start up some discussion. So given the COVID-19 situation, what are your thoughts on its impacts on Pacific participation? And will it affect the positions of the Pacific Islanders attending COP?
Yeah, this one's huge. I might actually leave the floor open. Anybody who wants to reflect on this. This is huge. Will the Pacific be able to participate, and what will be the implications? So anybody, please.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, sorry, Mahendra here. I mean, does anyone have any idea of how many delegations are confirmed? In fact, there seems to be mixed messages, and I think there's still, as you said rightly, a lot of challenges in terms of going across. I think the concession UK made in terms of paying for the quarantine is just a very small gesture, which really is a very, I mean, it doesn't deal with the quarantine situations and of course now the cost of participation in terms of hotels and travel is going to be at a premium, so that's also very challenging. So it will be very interesting to know how many Pacific delegates would actually be there.
Anybody have any intel on their own countries, wherever you're dialing in from, if your country will actually be attending in person? I can say that Vanuatu, a decision has been made at the highest level that there will be no delegates traveling to COP from the Pacific. So that's an official, published position. Any other countries have positions like that already?
And given that, Chris, I mean, there seems to be reluctance to even open up the sessions remotely, like was done for subsidiary bodies because of opposition from some key countries. I mean, could PICAN and the NGOs sort of impress upon them that there are many of us who won't be going, but would really like to dial in spite of the challenges, time difference, and so on, for appropriate sessions. Thank you.
Well, I think it's considering the fact that we don't really know much information about the country delegations, it's probably best if we table this question for another time. We can move on to the two new ones we have in the chat box. So there's one from Chris. Oh, sorry, this is directed to Chris. It's from Marco. He's asking, what can CSOs from the Pacific Rim do to more effectively support Pacific Island CSOs and Pacific Island countries?
Yeah, thanks very much, Marco, for that. I think this is a really important question because in the Pacific, we tend to have a much closer relationship with our governments than in other parts of the world. And in all Pacific Island countries, there are capacity limitations and governments are stretched with negotiators doing 10 other jobs. And I think the more we as civil society can do to articulate positions that are representative of the grassroots and the most vulnerable and the people who are suffering and provide those to governments, the more chances we'll have of actually having those governments take up those positions and make them at COP26. So I think there's actually a role for us to listen to our constituents and then articulate them in negotiation policy language that our governments could take on. I also think it's very important that we unify as a Pacific in our calls, which can then be amplified by other actors, CAN International and others. So over the next month, it's going to be really important that all civil society agencies that have even a little bit of interest in climate change input into this process for developing and endorsing the COP26 Pacific positions. Really good questions.
We have a question from Makareta. I see she's unmuted, so would you like to read out your question to Dr. Chris?
Okay. Can you hear me? Sorry. Yeah? Yeah, I actually have two questions. One was, every year commitments are made that dates back to 2019 when they talk about 1 billion each year to be made by developed countries, but very little have been seen. And it's sort of like, realistically, I'd like to know whether we are going to be able, is this going to be progressed in this COP? That's my first question. The second one is, I remember in COP, in the COP23, PICAN was doing a brief, not every day, but when important events happen. And there was someone from, I think it was the coordinator then, it was Langi's predecessor. So, be doing 5-minute session on what happened on the day or giving us pointers. There'll be many of us who won't be there, giving us pointers on what to watch out for. And in this case, since a lot of things will be done on remote, for those of us who are not there, be interesting for someone to be telling us, you might be interested in this, it's very relevant for the Pacific. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margareta, and good morning to you. Yeah, I thank you for acknowledging the work of PICAN at COP24 and COP25. So Jenny Jiva, the previous coordinator, was absolutely fantastic in doing those kinds of daily updates. And we definitely want to see that happening in the lead up to, during, and immediately after COP. So I mentioned at the beginning, we are going to be hiring in the next week. We're going to put out an advertisement for 6 COP26 PICAN officers, basically. And they're going to be right from now through COP doing this kind of daily, hourly, what's going on, what's important, did you know, making it relevant to the Pacific. So if you know anybody who's interested in applying for one of those positions, definitely when it comes out through the PICAN list, share that widely, because I think that's, as you mentioned, a critical function that we've got to see at COP26 this year. In terms of your question about finance, so there are 2 places where I can see discussions on finance coming out at this COP. And actually will tell us a bit more about this later in his session. But the first one is, we're going to start the process for the new global goal for long-term finance. So the current global goal, $100 billion per year by 2025, by 2020 going through 2025, we actually have to have a new goal. And so we're going to start the discussions on the new goal now. So we could actually put as a part of those negotiations what we expect the new goal to cover, the amount, the way, the accessibility, the mechanisms, the oversight. I mean, that can be part of those discussions. The other important part of finance, which is coming out this year, or discussions on finance this year, are the transparency negotiations. So we're going to be negotiating on how countries have to report on the finance that they've provided. Now, this gets very scary for countries, rich developed countries, because they can give a nice round figure. But if we negotiate really well this year and get Excel tables that are very detailed, that leave no question about how the money's come, who's it gone to, what kind, was it grant, was it loan, then we can get a much bigger picture, a better picture of what kind of finance is arriving in the Pacific. But we've actually got to negotiate those tables. If we don't say anything, if our voice isn't heard, then the big rich developed countries are just going to have a nice little table with 2 columns with, yes and yes. So we need real detailed transparency tables, and I think that'll help us. Also, I wanted to mention, in terms of finance, there's a lot going on in terms of the alternative mechanisms for finance that we're going to hear about at COP26. Some of these innovative sources like climate damages taxes and fossil fuel levies and things like that. There'll be a lot of discussions on finance related to loss and damage at COP26 outside the negotiations, but kind of as part of the overall space. And Atina, I noticed in the chat, I think Margareta asked if there was a possibility to record this or make this available. So yes, what is the, I noticed there's only about 30 people here, but we want to get this out to all the thousands of civil society people in the Pacific. So how are we going to do that?
We could keep the recording. Well, that's why we're recording the session. We're going to record it and we'll probably upload it to the internet, so probably YouTube. But yes, this will definitely be made available once the recording's been put together. And yes, also through the PICAN Facebook page.
Yeah. Sorry, if there's no one else, just one last, picking up from Chris's observation that the NGOs are very close to governments here, which is a very good, which is nice to know. Could we somehow prevail more directly with governments in terms of their positions? Because I know there have been a lot of pre-COP meetings on various issues like the carbon, the Article 6 and carbon trading and stuff like that. A lot of issues still need to be sorted out, but I'm not even sure what the government's sort of positions in on these subjects are. So is there any way in which we could somehow prevail on the government delegations? I mean, yes, giving out statements one thing, but then trying to sort of work more directly with them. And ensuring that our voices are heard at the negotiations. Thank you.
This is a really good question, Mahendra. I think that by and large this year, the PCIDs have taken the default position of AOSIS, and will be supporting AOSIS in its calls in all thematic areas. So if we really as Pacific civil society want to see what our Pacific governments are going to be calling for, it would be to go and look at those AOSIS positions on the submissions portal. And then, yeah, if we want something new, additional, or more ambitious, then to make those calls and propose them to government. My experience in Vanuatu is that government is very inclusive when it comes to listening to the private sector or civil society. And I think they would welcome any kind of suggestion from civil society. I don't know if that applies to other Pacific Island countries, but certainly worth a try.
Thank you. We'll take one more question, and that question will be has already been posed by Margareta. She's asking, where are we with regards to viable insurance, and has there been any progress?
Yeah, this is really interesting. So the idea of insurance was actually first proposed by Vanuatu way back in 1991 when talking about compensation for sea level rise. And since then, the loss and damage mechanism, the WIM, has been looking at risk transfer mechanisms, which include insurance. But sadly, insurance has kind of become a default call by the rich developed nations to pay for climate loss and damage. They say, oh, we'll just get insurance. But for us, as you very well know, we and our farmers and our fishermen and our villagers can't engage with insurance mechanisms very well. It's just not logistically or financially or economically or culturally what's done here. So by developed rich countries always calling for insurance to pay for loss and damage, and us always coming back to say, well, it's not actually going to work, this is where there's a big kind of disagreement. And I think we in the developing world, specifically AOSIS and LDCs, are constantly calling for public finance for adaptation, public finance for loss and damage, and not to put all of our eggs in an insurance basket. And in regards to your question, how have we gone with viable insurance? There has actually been some pretty cool stuff in the Pacific. So the PICAN, the risk insurance facility, the Tuvalu Survival Fund is kind of like a national insurance mechanism. There was recently, actually just last week in Fiji, launched a new farmer parametric insurance where farmers can buy certain lots of insurance and they get paid out based on the amount of damage that they suffer. So some interesting things going on in the region, but we definitely want to make sure that we're continuing to call for public finance for loss and damage and making the polluters pay and not always putting it back on the individuals who are suffering to buy insurance. But really good. Thank you so much for those questions, everybody.
Thank you. We'll wrap up now because we're supposed to take a 15-minute break until the next session, which will also be held by Dr. Chris, and he'll be covering loss and damage.